What if Jesus was inviting you to experience Him where heaven meets earth? Are you looking for more of Him or ways to experience Him in fresh new ways? I'm inviting you into our tabernacle study. It's called Centering on Christ because that's exactly what it's about. Deeper, more intimate worship of Him by discovering the symbolism, the ultimate fulfillment of the tabernacle in Christ. And I promise you, it's the furthest thing from boring or stale like the Old Testament can sometimes feel. You're going to discover Him as your dwelling place and you as His dwelling place. You're going to experience God's timeline of grace from Eden past to heaven future. Now, what some people are saying who've done this study, Morgan says that these have been an incredible blessing in her journey. Marilyn says that it's pure gospel attitude. That's what some previous participants are saying. And it's for you to experience now. Go to gospelspice.com/tabernacle. And if you signed up for our newsletter, there is a coupon code. So don't miss out on that. gospelspice.com/tabernacle. And now today's episode.
Bonjour, and welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture to spice up your relationship with God. Here is your host, Stephanie Roussel, with a guest today.
Today, I'm welcoming Holley Gerth. She and I are going to talk quite a bit about her, so I'm going to keep that intro super short. She likes to say she is an expert snacker, excellent napper, and that just cracks me up. And she's also a Wall Street Journal best-selling author. She is very full of wisdom, and she likes to say that she likes humans, words, and good coffee. See, I like her already. Holley Gerth, welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about you, your life, your story, your people, your heart for God, your ministry, all the things.
All the things.
Yeah, all the things. That's what I want. So tell us about you.
I am the granddaughter of Christian bookstore owners, and I'm named after my grandpa, Holley. So I grew up loving words, being that little girl curled up in the back of a bookstore, dreaming one day of being a writer too. And God graciously let that happen. I started out as an intern for Dayspring, the Christian subsidiary of Hallmark, and spent about a decade of my career there before transitioning out to start writing books, which I've done for about another decade. So I'm passionate about helping people embrace who they are and become who God created them to be. In my personal life, I'm married to my college sweetheart, Mark, for over 2 decades now, and we have a crazy family story.
Yes, I want you to tell us about your family story.
Yes, so we couldn't have kiddos of our own, and God introduced us to a young woman named Lavelle who had aged out of the foster system. She was 20 at the time, and He made it clear that she was supposed to be our daughter. And so we became a family. Then she got married and had a couple littles, and so I get to be Nana too. And it's really fun because the day Lavelle changed her last name to ours is August 28th, and we always celebrated it every year as a family, like a birthday. We called it Gerth Day. And our granddaughter, Eula, was born on Gerth Day.
Oh,
wow. So it's like God was saying, you felt like I forgot you or my timing was off, and I always had it down to the day. And so I love our family story. It's not what I could ever have imagined, but I think He gives us even better than we imagined. So that's a big part of my story too. So I'm currently still writing books. I have a podcast called More Than Small Talk. Do some other fun things. I say I'm an expert snacker and an excellent napper. Those are some of my other skills.
I know. I love this. I can so relate to that. I totally get it. I love this so much. Excellent snacker and excellent napper. Oh, girl, you're a girl after my own heart.
So if we were having coffee with all your listeners, I would want to say, now tell me about you, because I would much rather listen.
Yes, because you're an introvert. And that's been a big theme of what you have done in ministry is help those among us who are introverts feel more confidence in the fullness of their identity. Because this culture, I have to say, I'm not an American, but I have to say, I think the American culture really caters to extroverts and honors extroverts in an unusual way. I mean, I obviously don't know all the cultures, but the French culture doesn't put extroverts as much as what it seems like almost a pedestal as the American culture does. And so I would have to imagine I'm really kind of a
half introvert, half extrovert myself, but people who are really introvert, it must be a little difficult in this culture. And what you do is that you really tell introverts, this is your season to shine, and you allow them to take hold of the beautiful ways that God has created them. And I really want us to talk about that. But before we talk about that, I want to go back to something you said, because it really got me thinking. You said that your family story is not what you thought it was going to be. So how did you navigate those seasons where you were discovering that your family story was very different from what you had imagined?
Yes, well, a lot of crying in bathrooms. Well, but we went through actively trying to have a family for about a decade. And so that is a lot of grief. And I think for those listening, that may not be your specific journey, but maybe there's a dream that you have hoped would come true that hasn't yet, or a job you really want, or anything in your life that is an unmet desire. And so I think it's important for us to know that that is cause for grief. And it's okay to feel all the emotions that come with that: sadness, anger, longing, all of those things. And so I went through all of that. And it was a long process. And then I remember God just slowly started changing my perspective, especially on what it means to be a mother. Eve is called the mother of all living. And I felt like he showed me all women are mothers, because all women bring life into the world in some way. And so I thought, well, I'm going to be a book mama. I'm going to bring, books into the world. That's what I'll do. And my first small group even had a book shower for me that was like a baby shower.
That is adorable. I've never heard of book showers.
So I came to a place where I was, at peace about where we were. And people would say, where are you in that story? And I'd say, I'm at peace about it. And they would look a little like, I'm not sure I believe you. And I would say, it's the kind of peace that comes after war. I think there's a certain kind of peace that you fight for. And that was peace I fought for year after year, me and Jesus, where I was able to come to a place of acceptance of where I was. And then I was ready for my daughter to come. A different ending. It was like I had to release a story that I thought I was supposed to have in order to embrace the story that God had actually written for me, which was even better. And so I think that's one thing for people listening, going through a season of maybe an unmet desire or hope or dream, is to say it's okay to deeply grieve that your story doesn't look like you thought it would. But you can also live with the hope that God is writing what might be an even better story. Mm-hmm. And so that was my journey. That I can say that very non-emotionally now, but it wasn't always that way. There was a lot of tears and frustration. I think one time I yelled out my window at pregnant cows in the spring.
How dare they? How dare they?
I'm like, you have no idea how easy it is for you. So,
question for you. You said, how God, he delivered a better story for you once you had come to terms and really gone to that place of peace after the war. Has anyone, it sounds, and I know that's not what you're saying, but has anyone ever told you that you were holding back the blessing of God because you were in pain and grief? Because sometimes it's this idea that we hear from people who are trying to be helpful, but don't know that it is, that are saying, well, just get over it. And you're the one who is blocking the blessing of God because you're not over it yet. So hurry up to get to that place of peace, because only then will God bless you, which is not true. This is absolutely not true. So in other words, is it our fault that we do not have the life we want because we're messed up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I ask that question sometimes. I was like, is something wrong with me? Like, am I doing something wrong that this hasn't happened for me? And I think that the answer is no. We're just humans with a limited perspective, and we come up with stories of how our life's going to go. And then when that doesn't align with God's plan, we blame ourselves. And that's not it. It's just that we serve a God who doesn't think like we think. who doesn't write stories like we do, who doesn't have plans that look like ours. And so, no, it's the opposite. Like in my story, he was inviting me to an even better story. It wasn't that I was holding back, being held back by where I was in my grief. It was that he was holding me through my grief and saying, I have even more for you than you can imagine right now. And so I did have people say all kinds of crazy things to me, like from, I just know you're going to have a baby, to one person said, if you'll just quit your job and drop out of grad school, I'm sure that you'll get pregnant because stress keeps you from having a baby, And so I kind of learned to translate that into, they were trying to say, I love you and you're in pain and I want to make that pain stop. And so I'm going to say the only thing I can think of. And so what that helped. And then I think when people, sometimes they want to feel like this can't happen to me. And so when someone's saying, oh, you're blocking the blessing of God, that makes them feel safe, because then they think, well, as long as I don't do that, then I won't walk through what this person is walking through. And so I think that there's people who want to make us feel better because they love us and they just choose the wrong words with good intentions. And then I think there's a sense of fear when we see someone going through something hard. And sometimes we spiritualize things so that we don't feel as much fear. Like, this person must be doing something wrong. Therefore, if I do everything right, this won't ever happen to me. And so that's what it feels like if someone were to say, you're blocking God's best for your life because you don't have peace yet. That feels like someone who's scared of hard things happening, saying, as long as I do everything right, then things won't go wrong in my life. And she must not be doing something right.
Actually, is a false gospel. I mean, because Jesus did everything right. And the cross.
Yeah.
So
True.
Doing everything right is actually the opposite of a cure against suffering. It probably is going to lead to some form of suffering, because in Christ, that is, right? I mean, there's enough suffering in the world in general, but I mean, as Christians, to think that it's a form of, believing this prosperity gospel, that if you do everything right, then life is going to be good for you and God is going to bless you. Ultimately, yes. And Jesus is blessed beyond imagination, but it took the cross. And the cross isn't just a blip in history. It is the crucial watershed moment of everything, which means, he tells us to pick up our own crosses. And so when you do everything right, that is when chances of suffering are actually going to not increase, but at least be very real. You are not removing the probability of suffering when you walk in fullness of faith. You are choosing a different kind of suffering, the suffering that isn't the consequence of sin or the consequence of foolishness, but you're choosing to side with the suffering of Christ. That's a daunting thought. And that's what you've experienced. I would suspect that your faith and your trust in your Lord was shaped through that ordeal.
Yes. It was. It certainly taught me that I was not in control.
And obviously that you've learned that it's a good thing, because when you were saying, God's will isn't always our will, you've learned that his will is better than your will for yourself. And you've learned to surrender to it. But that wasn't easy. No. It took what you went through.
Yes.
And that's inspiring, because that helps all of us when we go through hard times to remember that. And so, okay, I want to switch gears just a bit. You said something else that tickled me, and I want to talk about that. You said that you finally experienced the true lasting peace of after the war. Were there, in that season or in any other season of suffering you may have gone through, were there moments of temporary peace that you thought were maybe the final lasting peace, but then you were thrown back into another battle? Because there's peace after battles, but then there's peace after the war. And that's very, very different. And was it discouraging for you, if that happens, that you had peace, which you thought might be lasting peace? Oh, I'm finally at peace with my situation as not being a birth mom. I'm not having a biological child. only to realize that there actually were deeper layers that God was working through, and you were back on the battlefield. If that happened, how did that feel?
Well, I think that whole journey, monthly, I would go into a sense of peace, like, oh, I think I'm pregnant. This is going to finally happen. And then finding out I'm not, I would lose that peace again, and I think that what I learned in that season is that when we base our peace on a specific outcome, a specific result, then it's not sustainable peace. It's temporary peace. But when we realize ultimately peace is a person, then that is what we can rest in no matter the circumstance. And that's a transition I felt like I had to make from, I want to control this, I need to get the outcome I want, I have to have things the way I want them, to God, I don't get this. It's hard. It hurt. I don't understand it, but I believe you're good anyway. And I can rest in that. And so that, I think, is the place. Even now, I just went through another difficult season. And I feel like that is the place. I don't always live there as much as I would like because I'm human, but it is the place I find I go back to again and again. Not what is going to happen. That's where we're tempted to look for peace, but who is God always? And that is where I can find peace.
Mm-hmm. And faster, you run to that peace of mind in Christ faster now because you know the way.
Yeah.
Because you forged the way, and now the way, even in terms of neural pathways, it's literally carved into your brain. So it's easier to get back to that place faster. Easier, not easy, at least in my experience, right? It's never, I don't know that it ever gets easy. Actually, when I think of Jesus in Gethsemane, I mean, he did ask for the cup to pass. So even he, in that moment that obviously none of our circumstances could ever compare to, but he gasped at the horror awaiting him. And he had a lifetime of going to the Father in all circumstances and never, ever deviating one iota from the will of the Father, unlike the rest of us. And in that moment, there is that very strong desire to have that cup pass. And yet he is so surrendered to the will of the Father that his desire for the cup to pass is submitted under the authority of the will of the Father. That is, what a God we serve.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay. So I love your wisdom because it's hard earned. It is not shiny, glossy, off the pages of a book. It is hard earned wisdom. And you're very transparent and vulnerable. You're not afraid to share your own story, your own mistakes, what you've learned, trusting in the Lord. And so you are now passionate to come alongside people who have experienced hurt themselves, which is, well, everyone on the planet. I mean, I would suspect not to be, cynical, but anyone who's lived long enough, even with a good childhood, even with good parents, hurt is going to come. So how do you wish to inspire them? What do you wish to tell them? How do you want to help them? Anyone who's facing a deep season of hurt right now, or someone who has gotten so used to walking with a limp of that hurt that they don't even notice it, but they're limping nonetheless.
Well, last year was a really challenging one, really the last two, in a totally different way. I was in a situation where trust was broken. And that's a totally different kind of pain than what we've been talking about. And God took me on a different healing journey related to that. And so that's really where I've dug in the last year. And I think what I've realized is that when hard things come into our lives, we have the opportunity to go from hurt to healing to becoming a healer. And I love that. And that is the journey I've walked through. And again, is it easy? Not at all. Like excruciating in moments, but worth it? Yes. And so that is my hope and prayer for other people now, is to say, how can I come alongside others and help them go from hurt to healing to becoming a healer? And that looks different for all of us. For me, becoming a healer looked like creating content, a course. For someone else, it might be just comforting a friend over coffee. But I think that is God's design for all of us. And so I want people to not feel alone in that hurt, because I think when we're hurt, we feel like I'm the only one who's ever felt this way. It makes you feel crazy, It's very disorienting, I think, to be in a lot of pain and to have specific steps to go through, because I think that the lie we're sometimes told is healing is an event. If I can just believe enough or find this silver bullet, like, boom, I'm healed, and yes, God does that. But I think healing is more about a path, where a journey we go on with Jesus, where we do our emotional and spiritual work in partnership with Him. And that step by step, we move toward healing until one day we look back and say, wow, I am not where I was before. And so my heart is to go on that journey with people and to also say, I've walked this before. I can't do it for you, but I can tell you some things that helped. I can tell you some things that you can look out for. You don't have to do this on your own.
And what you just said, I can't do it for you, but I'll do it alongside you, basically. That's kind of what God is saying too, because He could say, I'm going to do it for you, like you said, and just snap His fingers and we're healed. But that is not the way, as you said, to become a healer, because then you need to walk with someone else and allow them to cling to the Lord as they're going through it. So I love how you're describing this. And so to be very practical, you have a course that you're offering, and I haven't done the course, but I've looked at some of the things you're offering there, and I love how practical it is. Again, I love how what you're providing is, even, across the screen, across the course, you're providing a very listening ear because you've been through it. You're not coming alongside someone with something you haven't gone through. And so you're providing something very practical. And we were talking earlier about how it feels and how you grieve the fact that your story doesn't look like you wanted it to look. So we talked about your own journey of motherhood. How is that a topic that you talk about in the course? And how would you say it's maybe a key moment for the person in their healing process?
So I think pausing to look at the stories we have told ourselves about a relationship, a dream, an expectation is important, because that's what we do as humans. Even when we go to the grocery store and we pick a line to check out, we tell ourselves a story about this is going to be the fastest line. And then someone else comes along and we're like, oh, And so even in the little things, but we are story making beings. And so whenever we encounter pain, it's because the story we told ourselves does not match the story we're living. So we had maybe a professional dream that turned out not the way we hoped. We have someone who we loved who walks out the door. We want to be a mother, and that doesn't happen. And our culture tells us how to grieve tangible losses. We go to funerals. We have rituals around tangible loss grief. We do not know how to grieve what we hoped would be and is never going to happen. And I think that is really hard. And so I think the first step of healing is to say, this is the story I told myself. It was a good story. I would love for it to be one that is coming true, but it's not. The story I'm living instead is this, and to put words to it and to be able to say, God, because there is a gap between those two lines, I feel grief. And I need healing. And I think that is the start of where God can say, I get it. I had the dream of a world that would look a certain way. It doesn't. But I still have a plan for good. I still have a story that's being written. And I want to do that in your life too. And so that is, I think, a starting place for all of us today to say, what story in my life did I tell myself that didn't come true? What's the story I'm living now? And how does God want to meet me in that place of grief?
And to take it back to what you were saying about the Lord and Him saying, the world hasn't turned out the way He wanted, basically. But that's only from the perspective of humanity that we say this, because we do not have the full picture. God in His divinity knows that the very fact that, before the creation of the world, His wanting to display His love meant the fallenness of man, because it meant the redemption through grace. Love is fully exhibited through grace, which requires the need for grace. And that's the very crucible in which he has placed us. And so from our perspective, it looks like the world didn't turn out the way God wanted, but God is saying, whoa, 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 story's not over yet. And that's what he's saying. None of our stories are over yet. And the grief can be, can't it, coupled with hope at the same time? How do you do that? How do you grieve and hope at the same time?
Yeah, so I think it's a process. So we ask, what was the story I told myself? What's the story I'm living now? What are the lies I'm believing because of that story? Because usually lies come in, like, I must have done something wrong. We've talked about that. That's a huge one for my story to look like this. And so saying, what is that? Then, God, what is the truth you want to replace those lies with? And then what is the new story that you have for me? It's like in my own experience, there was a new story that God had for me. And so I think those 5 questions, we move through them as we heal. And I said them all in a row, but there's often months, even years in between them. But we start with a broken story and we end up with a new story that God has for us. And I think in so many ways, that's the gospel, right? That is the gospel for all of us, that we were living a broken story and then a good God gave us Jesus so that we could have a new story. And I think that is what we walk through as we heal from whatever is hurting us in our lives.
And then we realized that this new story was actually the story that God wanted for us from day one. And that, before the foundation of the world, he planned all those good things for us, even though we're walking into them only now. And so we find out that this new story, quote unquote, is actually the story that it was all along, and that we're now joining him and entering into it because he has taken us through whatever valleys we had to go through to be ready to find the gateway into joining him in his story in our own lives. That's fascinating to hear you talk like that. Okay, what would you say to someone who is going through maybe not a massive grief? Because these two, I think we have more permission to grieve the great griefs. That's a tongue twister for this native French. But what about the tiny griefs of every day? You mentioned, the checkout line. That's tiny. Okay, we can get, but just the everyday, not the few major crises we'll all experience in life, but the things that happen day in and day out, the falling outs in relationships, the grief we receive from a relationship. Usually, I don't know, relationships is where it really hurts, right? I don't know if you're anything like me. Yes. It's usually in relationship, things really hurt. Not the make or break, but how do you grieve and how do you step into God's story in those in between kind of mid-grade griefs? Yeah. I'm sure you've got a better way to talk about that. That's why I'm asking you.
I think one of the first steps is saying those things are worthy of grief too. Because I think so often we dismiss them. We say, well, other people have it harder than me, or that's not a big deal. I need to just smile and get through this. And so knowing that we have a God who has the capacity to care about all of those things, it's like we don't want to wear him out, but that's impossible because he has endless capacity. And so I think for me, it was learning to say, even I feel grief about some of those mid-range losses, because I found if I tried to resist grief or push it away, then I would go into a cycle of what I call over responsibility. Instead, I would try to fix everything. I can't feel grief about this. And so I'm going to try to fix it. I'm going to try to fix myself. I'm going to try to fix other people. I'm going to try to fix the world. And I think we all have a cycle we go into to avoid grief. So mine is fixing. Some people might have escaping or numbing or overworking, and so what are we replacing grief with? Because as soon as I stopped fixing, that meant I had to confront my grief. And the beautiful thing about that was God could then meet me in that grief. And so I think, yes, one, saying this is worthy of grief. Two, I have permission to feel grief over it, even if it doesn't feel like a huge thing. And three, to say, God, will you meet me in this as I lay down what I'm tempted to do in my own humanness to fix this. And that is surrender. It's also, again, we keep saying it's not easy. I still miss it. Even yesterday, I was like, oh, I did that again. I went right back into that cycle. I went right back into fixing mode. And probably for the rest of my life, there will be moments when I resist grief by trying to fix things because it feels safer. But I think the starting point is to let God into those moments.
Exactly. I think what I'm hearing you say is you're less prone to fixing, or again, you're identifying it faster when you do it, because what you've increased is your self-awareness, which I believe in many ways is the foundation for us to realize that we need to be more God aware. So my self-awareness leads me to focusing on God more and faster. So it's back to what we were saying about just running to him faster, identifying those pathways much faster towards him. We talked about being an introvert earlier, and I want to kind of end on that. How would you describe maybe that the journey of grief might feel different or not for introverts or extroverts? And how do you come alongside an introvert in their grief?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that for introverts, because of the way we're wired, grief may be more of an inward process. And so we're doing a lot of internal processing. We may not always verbalize everything, where extroverts may naturally more outwardly express their grief, even facial expressions. You may more easily be able to look at an extrovert and say, they're in pain right now. Where an introvert, it might be a little harder. You might think they're fine. They look okay. And so I think that for both types, it's important to have a safe way to let grief flow through you. And so for an introvert, that might be journaling at first, and then maybe meeting one-on-one with a trusted person or a counselor. For an extrovert, they might want to start with another person in the room. They might want to say, I'm not really, wanting to process alone. I really want someone in the room with me. But having a safe way to let grief flow through us. And I think that's a big part of it. And then contrasted with grief, I, in my research, learned that introverts and extroverts experience happiness differently. So it's actually extrovert is based on our neurotransmitters and our nervous systems, a bunch of things. But for extroverts, happiness feels like enthusiasm and excitement. It's a more, again, outwardly expressed emotion, more of a high energy emotion. And introverts experience happiness more as calm and contentment. It's not as revved up. And so even I would say that's important to know for grief, because an introvert might be saying, I will know I'm healed when I feel super happy in a very high energy, way that we're told what that looks like. But probably for an introvert, healing is going to be more a restoration of calm and contentment and peace and steadiness. And so even that distinction, knowing what is healing probably going to feel like based on how I'm wired, and explaining that to people in your life, that if I'm in a place where I'm calm and content and peaceful and feel steadier again, that's what healing looks like for me. And so don't worry about me. If I am curled up on the back porch, looking peaceful, nothing's wrong. That probably means that I'm doing some healing. So those are a few things that come to mind.
That is so helpful. Again, so wise and so practical. And I love that. So Holley, this course on, getting past your hurt, We're going to have all the links in the show note. You're offering an amazing discount code for our listeners and our YouTube watchers. That's going to be in our next newsletter. So make sure to subscribe to our newsletter so you can get the code, so you can get a discount on this amazing course too. And I would say this course is for anyone who's going through grief. I suspect it's also good for people who are helping others go through grief. Right? So would you recommend that for people who are more on the healer side of things already, for them to come alongside someone in their own lives who's in pain, right?
Yes, I would hope that it would equip them, and especially relational grief. This course is especially if you've been hurt in a relationship with another person.
Right.
Then
Yes.
it's especially for that situation.
Well, Holley, thank you so much for being with us today. I know you're an introvert, and I know you don't like to be the center of attention, and you've given us a huge gift by sharing so much of your heart and your story and your relationship with God, even if it's a little uncomfortable for you to do so. It's more of a sacrifice that we receive with deep gratitude. So thank you so much, Holley.
Oh, thanks again for having me.
Hi, Jonah here. Thank you for being part of the Gospel Spice family. If you've enjoyed this episode, you will love receiving our newsletter. It contains value-packed free gifts and rich content each month. It's at gospelspice.com/sign-up. There is always something new and exciting happening around here, and I don't want you to miss out. Sign up at gospelspice.com/sign-up. Did you know Gospel Spice has a YouTube channel? There's exclusive content there too, so join Gospel Spice on YouTube. Also, please give us a star rating and a comment on your podcast listening app. Your reviews actually really do make a difference to help others discover and experience Gospel Spice. As always, we are praying for you. You can confidentially email us your prayer requests and praise items at the email address contact@gospelspice.com. It's our privilege to pray for you. So, I'll leave you with 4 things to do. Please pick one and do it at your convenience. 1. Sign up on our website for our newsletter to receive gifts you're going to love. 2. Find us on YouTube and see what content we've put together to help you grow closer to Jesus. 3. Rate Gospel Spice on your listening app. It's one of the easiest ways to share the gospel. And finally, 4. Tell us how we can pray for you. Merci.